Nush, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm excellent, although I am already choking up here before we even hit record on this podcast. But I am excited that you are here. Many of you who listen to many of the folks who listen to Making Chips very likely know your name because you've been such a force in the industry in the last couple of years. Host of your own couple of different podcasts, host or co-host, and advocate for women's issues and the next gen of manufacturing and the Sisterhood of the Trades and everything you're doing. So you are a very special co-host today. Mike and Nick are both unavailable, and in fact, I'm glad it turned out that way because I think having your voice in this conversation is really important. So let's introduce. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, and then I'll share what and why we're doing on this episode, and then we'll introduce our guests and get into it.
Of course. Well, thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be here and to be sharing this space with you all. My name is Nush. I'm the CEO of Sisterhood of Trades, and I'm also customer enablement and marketing at ProShop as of the beginning of 2026. I'm super excited to be diving into another aspect of manufacturing. For those of you who have been following along with what I'm doing, I have been working in a CNC shop for around 4 years now, or on and off for around 4 years, starting with operating all the way to quality. And now I get to work on the advocacy side because as of a year ago, I started a organization with a couple of tradeswomen friends to bring visibility and awareness to the experiences of women in the trades, mainly because people like Paul and people like Nick and Mike were constantly highlighting my story and my experiences, and I felt so seen. And I realized that is so rare in our industry for other women. And the only reason it's rare for them is because they're not actively posting themselves on LinkedIn. So I figured I would bridge that gap by becoming like a megaphone for these women to talk about these things and to also be, again, like our name, a sisterhood. We really aim to be a community where these women can come to us not only with problems that happen at work, but also personal life issues and goals and all sorts of things that they want to talk about, especially resources. So that's a little bit of an introduction about me.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I definitely encourage anyone listening that doesn't know Nush to connect with her on LinkedIn and follow her. She's doing great things in the industry. So to get to the topic today, I don't remember exactly when it was. Was it November last year?
November, I think it was 12th or 13th.
Well, it's taken a little while to get this together. I wanted to do it sooner, but scheduling is hard. But yes, there was a young woman named Amber Czech that was a welder at a company, and she was killed by a coworker. Just on whatever random day of the week, he grabbed a sledgehammer and bludgeoned her to death. And hearing that news was like, for me, it was like, you remember where you were when you hear a certain piece of news, like, and I'm old enough to remember the Challenger explosion, killed all those astronauts, 9/11, whatever big event. And, of course, being a man, being in this industry a long time, being white, being straight, I have never experienced any kind of violence towards me. I've never experienced any kind of racism or anything really at all. And so I realize that I'm in a position of real privilege, and by the nature of who I was born into this world as. And I know that's not the experience of many people in the industry. And I also know that not only do we need to help lead change in all organizations, but especially in the trades, because not only is it the right thing to do as a human being and as an organization to make your workplace safe and welcoming, but we simply can't afford to have half the workforce, half of our just entire country or countries just not participate in the workforce because they don't feel like it's a welcoming, safe place to be. There's so much demand for manufacturing. There's a resurgence right now, and we need all hands on deck to meet the challenge of what we need to do in the next many decades. And so I felt it was important that we talk about workplace safety on the Making Chips podcast. And so I researched and found a couple of organizations that I thought would be great to come represent this issue. And so I'd like to introduce our two guests here. We have Jessica Stender and Anna Van Balen.
Yep, just like Van Halen.
Yep. Fellow Van, last name with it starting with Van. Welcome. So maybe Anna, let's start with you. Can you introduce yourself and tell us about your organization and what you do?
Yeah, so I'm Anna Van Balen, and I have the privilege of working at Futures Without Violence. It's an organization that's been around for 40 years, really trying to advocate for the end of violence for women and children. And we were the ones that led the way around the Violence Against Women Act. But I'm very proud to say that we were one of the first organizations to really bring men alongside us as allies to combat domestic violence in our country. I lead our workplace and economic security work. And so part of that means I get to oversee what's called the National Resource Center for Workplaces Respond, that addresses domestic and sexual violence in the workplace. And so we have been leading that work for 16 years, working alongside employers and as well as labor organizations and workers who really want to address and combat all forms of sexual violence, including sexual harassment in the workplace. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Anna, very much. Now, Jessica, let's hear about your organization and what you guys do there.
So, my name is Jessica Stender, and I am the policy director and deputy legal director of an organization called Equal Rights Advocates. We are a national gender justice organization. We've been around for 52 years, and we fight for the rights of women and girls and people of other gender identities, mostly in the realm of workplace rights, a lot of issues around discrimination and harassment, as well as the rights of students to be free of harassment and assault in school. And then I'm also the co-chair of the policy committee of the National Task Force on Tradeswomen's Issues, which is a task force that's actually a project of ERA right now. And it consists of tradeswomen from all around the country, as well as allies who are advocating for respectful workplaces and access for more women into these jobs in the trades. So I really appreciate being here today to talk to you about this important issue.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Thanks for making the time. And Nush, I'd love to have you share a little bit, in your Discord server, which is a very modern thing for a young person to put together. You have a lot, like close to 1,000. Is that right?
Yes, we just hit actually over 1,100 members a couple days ago. So that's really exciting.
That's amazing. And so lots of young women and some allies as well in there. And you, as we prepared for this, you mentioned that safety comes up from your members. Can you maybe just share a little bit of either anecdotes or sentiment, and why you think this is an important topic that our listeners should have candid and frank conversations about their in their workplaces? Do they have a safe workplace? Is it welcoming, or whatever you think needs to be discussed?
Yeah. Actually, because there's so many conversations about workplace harassment, I had to create a new post, which that doesn't feel the greatest to say. But a lot of the answers that I've gotten talk about it being a daily struggle, like not something that doesn't happen to them. It's something that when you walk in to a shop, it's just kind of expected. And a lot of it is brushed off as like, this is the boys' club. It's okay. And if you can't handle it, you can't handle working in the trades. And that is such a dated mindset. And I don't know if this is really controversial, but I feel like that's why there's a lot of men's mental health issues too. It's because you're not respecting men and you're saying that they're not masculine if they can't handle it. It shouldn't happen, period. And a lot of the conversations that are in the Discord are, I'm not going to HR because I don't want to be seen as the problem. I don't want to be seen as the person who's scared or the tattletale. And it really sucks to see all that from our members because they'll be the same members who advise other girls speak up or, say something, do something. And it's hard because you can say all that, but you can't do it like yourself because you don't feel like you have the power to do that, which brings me back to Paul. Thank you so much for having this episode again, because I told you this earlier, but you have like a very prominent reputation, and people like me and Brooke are putting our voices out there to get stuff like this out there. And the fact that you are willing to also share this is amazing. And I'm very grateful that you're doing this.
Well, it feels like the least I can do. I have little sisters, and I guess I just feel protective. So, as I mentioned sort of in my intro, it's important for two reasons. One, it's just the right thing to do to have safe workplaces, welcoming workplaces, kind workplaces. Kindness is one of the core values that I've had in my companies for a long time, and I just think it's fundamentally important. It's funny when we talk about different things on this podcast and on my Machine Shop Mastery podcast. It's amazing how often core values and culture come into the conversation. Like even when we're talking about financing machines, somehow it ends up talking about culture and core values and things like that. And so I believe that it's just fundamentally important that all businesses that want to succeed and thrive need to focus on their culture, and a culture of acceptance and being open and being safe and being not blind to the potentially sort of underlying issues that aren't being brought up is just critically important. Not only because it's sort of the ethical and right thing to do, but because it's also just important in our industry that we welcome as many people into manufacturing as possible, because we need them all to put their weight behind helping our country and our economy and all our businesses grow. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, people always say that manufacturing is dark, dirty, and dangerous. And that third D could also stand for that workplace safety not being taken care of, and the employees not being safe also counts as your employees not treating each other safely or each other correctly. And I think obviously we're trying to change that in manufacturing. We're trying to change that image, but you can't really change it without addressing those issues. And I honestly think ever since a lot of us have been posting about Amber Czech, I've noticed a lot more, not of a change, but I've noticed a lot more people noticing and reporting things. And I think that is a step in the right direction. Hopefully this stuff never happens again.
Well, we know it will, but hopefully less. Yeah.
Hopefully less.
So you shared that many of your members talk about this being a daily occurrence. And so I'd love to maybe ask you, Anna or Jessica, from your perspective and the statistics that you know of, like how often is this happening? What percentage of women, report harassment or not feeling safe in the workplace?
So I will say that statistics are often hard to get because employers are not required to report. So a lot of the data we have comes from survivors themselves. And so what we do know, as far back as 2014, there was a study done on construction workers, female construction workers, who said that 88% of them experience harassment on a daily basis. Another study says that 70% of women in some trades report frequent gendered harassment, including all forms of vulgar, sexist comments. So either way, the point is that it's really high, it's pervasive, and as Nush said, it's daily, it's not a one-time occurrence. And that's what a lot of the statistics that we do have really confirm.
And I'll just add plus one to all that. And in our work with tradeswomen through the Tradeswomen Task Force and beyond, the number one issue that we hear about from tradeswomen and some of the non-binary trades workers is this issue of gender or sex-based harassment. And that often is kind of harassment of a sexual nature, kind of the types of inappropriate jokes or sometimes inappropriate touching, a naked woman sticker on a hard hat, that kind of thing. But also women we speak with in the trades often experience kind of sex-based harassment that may not be necessarily of a sexual nature. So comments about, women don't belong here, you should be home cooking for your husband. And all of that contributes to women who are already, of course, very underrepresented, feeling at the kind of very least uncomfortable, and then often, unfortunately, actually physically in harm's way. And we'll talk more about how that can escalate into physical violence. And as this tragic example that you raised, Paul, of Amber Czech, how it has in many cases. But so it is very common, and it is something that keeps women back from even sometimes entering the trades. And then the few that really are able to get a good paycheck, finally, sometimes they're pushed out and or retaliated against if they speak out, which I know we'll talk a bit more about that as well.
So, Nush, maybe I'll look to you. Where do you want to take this conversation next?
Well, since we have the three of you are like leaders in your industry, I'm curious to know, what are some policies that machine shop owners or just business owners in general can look into to start taking care of their team? And I'm going to use Paul as an example, because now that I work with Paul, I can kind of see how much of an emphasis their team puts on culture. And I wonder if there's something that employers can kind of focus on. From my perspective, it would be, don't reprimand your female employees when they come to you with a report. But at the end of the day, that can only go so far. And usually we all know how it goes. It ends with termination. And also hearing you guys talk about all those experiences made me remember some of my friends' experiences about being treated on a job site and how they honestly just up and left after that. And I think one of them is thinking about returning to the trade. So she completely left the trade. And I don't think she'll be coming back, which really sucks. But that's something that we have to really swallow and understand, like, we did that and that has to change.
Sure. So I feel like there's two parts to your question. One of it has to do with culture setting. And I think that's important for us to delve into, because we really believe that everyone plays a role in the culture that's created in an organization. It is set by the top, but everyone plays a role, from managers to stewards to workers. And so let's make sure we think about like all the different ways that we create culture. And some of that is created by policies. But some of that has to do with how we talk about safety in the workplace. Some of it has to do with the trainings that we provide, because it's, and I'll talk about policies in a minute, but one thing is you can have policies, but how you are referencing those policies, what it looks like to have posters in the workplace that talk about safety, specifically around harassment, all of that is part of what creates a culture that sends the signal of what is acceptable and unacceptable in a workplace. And so I think, I want us to go a little bit deeper into that culture piece, because I think that's what's like, yes, we can help people create policies, and in fact, that's what we do. We do it for free. And we can work with any shop owner who's interested in creating policies that address all forms of violence, and happy to share those resources. But I think culture is a great place to start, and a really simple thing to do to even assess your culture. If you're not sure, if you really think it's a safe workplace or not, is to do what we call a culture scan. And there are tools that you can use. We're happy to provide some of those, but it gives you an opportunity to really it's like a pulse check. What is happening in my workplace? What are the things that I don't see when I walk away, or when I turn my eyes away from, what's happening on the floor? And some of that can be done kind of more proactively in talking with folks. And some of that should be done anonymously, because not everyone's going to say, yes, this is an unsafe work environment, especially if it's the boss who's asking, right? And so it's a simple thing that you can start with to really make sure that, even if you're not sure, even if, maybe there are things you see that you know are questionable, but sometimes there are things that you're aware of. And a culture scan is a really simple way to start that conversation and start that practice to determine what's happening in your shop.
Okay, thank you for that. Jessica, did you want to?
Yeah, I was going to say I completely agree in any workplace, but especially in the trades, the importance of those at the top and then those in any kind of supervisory, managerial, foreman role, setting the tone for what is appropriate in the workplace. And so, as a lawyer, I'm often kind of explaining the difference between what might be an illegal action, prohibited by law, but also what's just pretty inappropriate for the workplace. And while it might not be quote unquote illegal, it really serves to make certain groups, in this case, it's usually women or other kind of marginalized groups that are underrepresented, feel uncomfortable in the workplace. And so having everyone know that the top leadership and then anyone else in a foreman or supervisory position knows that respect is key and that inappropriate behavior won't be tolerated is really key. And that can even be in how they convey, for example, training. And so, for example, an employer may have a really good training that they give or, posters on the wall, as Anna referred to. But if it's kind of referred to in a kind of demeaning way, oh, we got to do that required training again, that doesn't really make employees feel like the owner and or supervisors are truly invested in ensuring that it is a harassment-free space and one in which harassment won't be tolerated. And also recognizing that it's not a kind of one and done deal. And so you don't just give a training once a year or put a poster up on a wall and you've taken care of, protecting workers against harassment and discrimination. It's an ongoing commitment. And I think finally, what I would say is knowing that things should be generally nipped in the bud. And so there may be a comment that seems pretty innocuous, a joke that's a little off color, but it is true that when you kind of enable those things to continue, it can then build into something a lot larger. And so having supervisors or the foreman or whoever it is know we don't tolerate that kind of thing and telling everyone that that's not going to happen again is key to people really seeing it as a true commitment as opposed to just kind of window dressing.
And if I can add to that, I think something that we should state is that things don't escalate to the point of what happened to Amber Czech without an actual escalation of events. And it typically starts with sexual harassment. And that offhand comment, if no one does anything, they know that there's some permission to see how far they can take it. And so it is not uncommon that these types of events, and unfortunate as they are, there were some preceding actions that took place that escalated from comments to maybe touching to maybe threatening before it actually ended in violence. And so to kind of like really emphasize what Jessica said around nipping it in the bud, that's why it's so critical that the language that's spoken, how women are addressed on the floor, in the work setting, it really makes a difference to tell and set the tone and let people know how far you can take things. What am I going to get in trouble or not if I say something? And if they don't, then okay, well, this is acceptable. And then, and that's how it grows over time.
Thank you for that. I'm going to kind of speak on behalf of the sisterhood members because a lot of them work at companies that aren't that forward thinking and they don't really care that much for their employees. How about a young woman who's going through some stuff, some sexual harassment at work or workplace harassment? How would she go about holding her company accountable? Because a lot of these women don't have the ability to quit and leave. Some of them have families, and it's really hard to get paid a decent amount and work for somewhere that really takes your safety into account. I feel like a lot of the advice you guys have is great for companies who care about their employees. How do we actually make them care?
So I think you raise a good point, and we kind of touched on this before, but the fear of retaliation is very real in kind of pretty much any workplace for a woman or another person who is experiencing harassment and wants to do something about it. And we've seen in the trades worker world that is more heightened because it is often a much better paid job than what the woman was able to have previously. And often it's the first time that she's actually been able to support herself and her family in making a better paycheck. And so sadly, a lot of times harassment and inappropriate behavior is kind of sadly often considered just kind of a part of the price of the paycheck, essentially. And what I'm really happy about with Paul, with you convening this podcast, is that we can give some suggestions to those employers and owners who are committed to trying to address this. And we'll probably hopefully get to more of that. But for those women or others who are experiencing that kind of behavior, I always explain that there are laws on the books that, one, make it, give you the right to work in a harassment-free workplace and that protect you against retaliation. However, that doesn't mean that retaliation won't occur. And I always want a worker to be going in very clear-headed about if they are thinking about speaking out, not to dissuade them necessarily, but to know that issue of retaliation can happen. And it's just something to be very aware of. Having said that, often it helps, and I've seen especially in the trades area, for women to speak with if there are other women on the work site, or if there's a kind of tradeswoman type group that they're aware of, like yours, Nush, or like the National Task Force on Tradeswomen's Issues, to try to have some sisterhood in talking through issues they're experiencing and ways to deal with it. And also, if they are going to talk to a supervisor or foreman or their employer in any way about it, we want to recommend that they, write everything down and make sure they have, written down everything that happened to them and what happened when they spoke to their employer. And then on the employer side, and I know we'll talk a bit more about recommendations, really want to suggest that employers make it very clear that it is a place where if a worker feels uncomfortable about something that's happening, that they should feel comfortable to come forward and speak out about it. And to the extent possible, maintain confidentiality about that complaint or that report. Sometimes for an employer to do what they're supposed to do and try to address the harassment, stop the harassment, make it better for the worker, sometimes they can't maintain complete confidentiality because they have to go talk to the person who is doing the harassing, right? And try to make the situation better. But we've had experiences with tradeswomen who have spoken up with their foreman, and then a couple days later, or even with HR, couple days later, other guys on the work site who are completely uninvolved and really should have had no knowledge of that are calling her a baby or crybaby or a complainer, and she just can't take the heat. And so kind of ensuring on the employer side that they maintain confidentiality when possible is also really important.
I just also really wanted to bring this up real quick. I don't know if you guys heard this, but before Amber was murdered, she actually had reported the coworker to HR. I think it was like 5 times. So like hearing that was also like jarring because I realized that could have been any of my friends. That could have been me. That could have been any of my family's daughters. That could have been anybody. And she reported it multiple times, which, needless to say, is very disheartening. And I understand why a lot of girls don't want to go into the trades after hearing that. Actually, a lot of them, I don't know if you guys are on other forms of social media, but a lot of them were saying it looks like the trades aren't for me. And a lot of their parents were also steering them away from the trades. I mean, it makes sense. When my parents heard of that, they were like, I am glad you're not working in a shop anymore. And that kind of broke my heart because my heart is in a shop. And I don't really know where I was going with this. It's just really, like, it's something I wanted to put out there. Like,
Yeah.
she did report it to HR multiple times, and yet that still happened. And knowing that could be any one of us is scary. It makes you not want to go into work the next day. So many of our members actually had like very strong feelings about the whole murder after, like, the week after our Discord was wrecked, and we didn't even know her personally. It was just the thought of that could have been any of us.
Well, in that example, clearly it was a major failing of that company that it had been reported multiple times and they didn't do enough. I mean, of course, we don't know all the details of what they tried to do or didn't do, or just put it in a file and close the filing cabinet. But I would hope that any owner or leader in the metalworking nation, listeners of this podcast, wouldn't knowingly promote an unsafe workplace. But clearly these workplaces happen, and I think it's incumbent on them to dig deeper. In a small, there's a lot of small shops out there, right? 20 people or around that size, and it would be hard to imagine that there aren't clues to problems that exist in the workplace, even if they're just not really directly surfaced to the owners, again, who hopefully are just not promoting this in the first place, but they're not having their ear to the ground well enough. So, Anna, your comments about doing an audit, I think that's really important. When I was thinking about my own shop days, I don't remember ever having to have, conversations and policies and training about this. It just was so abundantly clear that that was not even remotely acceptable. If you came and worked at Pro CNC, you cared about your coworkers, you treated everyone fairly, and it just, I don't know, it just never came up, and I guess in some environments it has to come up because there's not enough of a foundation of sort of fundamental good values that this is not the way we treat people. So if that is the case, where those values aren't front and center, and everyone just kind of realizes right from the get-go that it's not acceptable to say inappropriate things to people or to harass people in any way, that then you need to put formal policies in place and hopefully be serious about them, not just lip service, and not just something that you can put in your HR manual and not actually pay attention to, but something that really is important, and you, just like any good core value should be, you talk about it frequently, and it's just something that is truly bought in by everyone that works there. And if they can't buy into it, then they shouldn't be in that workplace.
Yeah, I was talking with some tradeswomen after the murder of Amber Czech, and it was pretty horrifying because of the previous murder several years back of Udi Hicks, where it was a similar workplace, a person at the workplace who murdered her, and people feeling that even though after that initial murder of Udi Hicks several years back, there was some kind of more attention on this as an issue to address, but that it clearly, we were not seeing the change we needed at the kind of ownership level and, higher level within a company. And one woman made a point which just stuck with me, which was, you see these companies have this zero tolerance policy for safety violations and safety issues, and the amount of importance they put on a safety violation or a potential safety issue. I want to see that type of importance and care put on harassment and violence, and ensuring respectful workplaces. And kind of just goes to your point, Paul, that making it clear from the top down that inappropriate behavior will not be tolerated, and that this is a workplace in which, sure, we follow the law, but we also go above that and beyond that to say we're going to make sure that it's inclusive and welcoming for everyone, to make it a better workplace, but also to ensure that it doesn't escalate into these much more severe and dangerous situations.
I also just wanted to take a moment and go back to the question that Nush had raised, as far as like if a woman wants to bring a complaint forward, what should they do? I also want to make sure that they should be fully aware of like everything that could happen, and retaliation is real. We've seen it across multiple forms of violence, and it's not just in losing a job, but it could be loss of pay, a loss of an opportunity. It could be maybe reduced work hours, so it takes on many different forms. But I just wanted to uplift, if they do and they understand, like there are a couple of things I would want them to keep in mind. And one is, I hate to say it, but to create a safety plan. If they're going to work, how are they taking into account what unfortunately could happen? And so that a safety plan is a common tool used across the field to ensure that there's you're thinking ahead of what could happen. And so maybe it's, anything from like mace to like maybe a phone call or a resource or the police. Maybe it's even going as far as taking the steps of a restraining order if they don't feel safe. There are tools that exist. Now, can it prevent something like this fully happening? No. But we know that it can help create some buffers that I would want to make sure that are in place before they take a formal action, especially if the workplace is not being responsive to complaints about women and what they're bringing forward as far as their concerns. The other thing I just kind of wanted to bring up is just allyship. And, there's training, and then there's bystander training. And we don't talk about that enough, and the role that other men on the floor could play in situations like this. And so we know from research that, there are a lot of men who actually privately care about these issues, but publicly don't feel comfortable doing so. And so there's a place to also like bring men alongside, and maybe that woman brings one of her colleagues that she knows is supportive to help support the harassment and to combat it. Be it on the floor or going to HR or to the company, it brings an added weight. It's unfortunate that that's what it takes, but that is how we start both addressing the culture piece, but it can help provide safety for that woman at the same time. And so I think there's more we can do to really lift up the role that other men play in the workplace and that they can play in really creating a safer workplace for all. And so, that should be an important part of that training is like, what do you do? And if people don't know, there's some really simple things that you can do as a bystander. You don't have to say, hey, that's wrong. You don't have to do that. If it could be as simple as redirecting a conversation. It could be like, hey, Paul, did you know that the other day there was a game and did you watch the game? And all it's doing is buying time for that woman to walk away or to go seek help. It's as simple as a redirect. It can be actually confronting people and saying, hey, that was inappropriate. Why don't we move on and work on this other issue? But those are some simple things that people don't always realize are incredibly powerful that a bystander can do to show support in the moment, be it if they feel comfortable addressing it directly or not. Just really just redirecting the entire situation to something different. And so I want people to walk away knowing that like there are multiple things and opportunities that people can do from very formal ones to more informal things. And all of it makes a difference.
Right. And speaking of allyship, the Sisterhood of Trades just started a new update. So we actually allow allies and people who support women in the trades to be in our Discord, and we actually encourage it so that way they can also hear some of their experiences, learn and unlearn bad habits, and understand where they can help support us, especially because a lot of the people who have been joining are, again, people who are in positions of power who may be able to directly communicate with other people in power and, tell them like, hey, this might not be right. This might not be how you want to handle it. And we've been noticing our members are a lot more excited to communicate with these people. It doesn't feel like they're going to a boss and they're going to be reprimanded. It feels like they're genuinely getting advice from someone who's in a position that they might want to be in, which I think is very important.
I wanted to say that I fully agree with everything Anna just said about the importance of others on the work site. Often it's men coming in and being an ally when someone is experiencing harassment or just kind of an inappropriate situation. And I was talking to a tradeswoman who was working on the job site. She was the only woman on the job site. And a male coworker made a sexual joke in front of a group of them. She was the only woman there who worked on that job site. And she told me that she felt uncomfortable. And that afterwards, one of the other guys came up to her and said, I heard that happen. I want to check in with you. He didn't quite use those language, but essentially like, I want to follow up on that. And and she really appreciated that because she actually said she probably wouldn't have wanted him to say something in that moment, although often men do, and that's great. But she personally kind of didn't know how to handle it and wanted to just kind of wait for the situation to end and let it pass. But she really appreciated that he came up to her and said that wasn't okay. Like, are you okay? And so just kind of emphasizing what Anna said, that being an ally can take a lot of different forms. And some of your listeners, Paul, might know about this, but there's the iron workers have a program called Be That One Guy. And that was kind of a really important step forward for that. That's in that union context, but it really can be applied to any workplace, union or not, or, any other place that these types of harassing issues come up and harassment comes up. And really it's focused on making sure that men in a male-dominated field like the trades have the resources they need to try to support women. And that goes both, speaking out if there is an inappropriate comment made, but also just trying to go beyond that and make women feel more included in the work site, ensuring that if they need some help with a certain work task, they have it. if they need training on something, that they support them with that. So it goes beyond just kind of trying to make sure they're not being harassed or supporting them in that, which is important, but also just generally making women and others feel comfortable. And I appreciate that Be That One Guy program sees this harassment as a workplace safety issue. And again, coming back to the need for all employers to see this as not just kind of doing the right thing, which it is, to make women and others feel comfortable on the work site, but also to really treat it as a workplace safety issue that needs to be taken seriously.
Yeah, I would encourage any owner, leader in a business, or anyone in the business really, to even be proactive. If there's a female employer, a new employee coming on, to say, hey, we try to make an environment here that's safe and welcoming, but sometimes things happen, and I want you to know that my door is always open. You can always come talk to me about something that you're concerned about. And I'm sure that hearing that from just a peer or a leader in an organization would just provide a level of comfort coming right in, that, okay, maybe this is going to be a different experience than I've had in the past, and maybe this is a safer and better place for me to work. And I definitely can understand the dynamic where, when people are joking around, or someone is making, a comment or saying or doing something that's inappropriate, that it's oftentimes those maybe a little bit more alpha males that are just like, I'm kind of the big shit around here. If I make a joke like this, you just deal with it. That some other men might not feel comfortable challenging that, especially in the moment in front of others. But I would just encourage anyone who is a bystander for anything of this nature to just really just anchor in their own values. Imagine that person was your sister, your mom, your grandma, your niece, whoever. And like, would you be okay with someone talking to a family member of yours that way? And if you're not, then speak up, either in the moment or privately with that person later, or, to leadership, and say, hey, I really feel strongly about this was not okay, and I think we need to do something about it.
Right. And if you're leadership, pay attention to that stuff and don't let that stuff slide. Like, you calling that out, especially as a leader, is so important. And so, I don't want to say life-changing, but it is very eye-opening and life-changing to that employee who's being affected by that comment.
Yeah. And I was going to say, the benefit of addressing inappropriate behavior, ensuring a respectful work site, it's not just for the women who often are the recipients of the harassment. It's also creating a better workplace for everyone. And just generally speaking, but also to your point earlier, there is a need for the skilled workforce. And when you have, 50% of the broader national workforce ish, feeling somewhat intimidated and or not welcome, or for the few who do get these jobs, either feeling scared for their safety or uncomfortable, such that they might leave the job or be pushed out or be, intimidated from entering it, that's a problem. And so ensuring that you have this respectful work site isn't just helpful for the women who are often the recipients of harassment, but for the broader workplace and for employers to have a skilled workforce and diverse workforce.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. One of the things we talk about often, as I mentioned earlier, we often come back to core values and culture, is that companies are just better off cutting out the cancerous people that do not align with their culture and their values, no matter what it is, whether it's just generally being a nice person at work and treating people, with respect or ethics, or, whatever the values and culture of that business are. And I can't think of a single example where I heard of a story where someone made a decision to let someone go because they were just sort of cancer to the culture, that they didn't, or that where they regretted getting rid of someone that that fit that description. Is always the right choice. Usually they wish they had done it sooner. And sometimes you can coach and mentor and work with someone to get them more aligned with the company's values. And if you try that and you just cannot, then they just don't belong there, right? And so I think this particular topic is just like any other value in the business. If it's just doesn't align with you, you just need to take action to get rid of it. And Anna, you mentioned doing an audit. If a leader is thinks their culture's okay on this front, but they're not really sure. What other things might you suggest they do? Or if there is an incident reported, like what should be in that you talked about a safety policy or a procedure. What should be in that to something tactical that a listener can then, start putting something in place or go checking in with their team.
Yeah, I will say that this is a really great opportunity to go read what's in those policies, because if we're honest, most places create policies. You give a copy to your employee, but no one reads it. And so this is an opportunity to revisit and actually see what's in there, what's missing. Sometimes harassment is mentioned, but sometimes it's just mentioned as generally as a code of conduct. And so maybe you need to really rethink a section that includes sexual harassment and actually all other forms of sexual violence. We don't want people to stop at sexual harassment and say that's it, because we know from our work that all forms of violence need to be addressed. And then I think Jessica mentioned training. So once you've updated those policies, you got to update that training that you provide, and then not just be a check the box opportunity, and use it to have conversations with the staff about what's happening, what is acceptable, things that need to change, or just values that need to be enhanced, and revisited. Kind of to your point, Paul, about like the values that really drive, for many people and many shop owners, many owners, that the work that they do. And so, the scan is one thing, but then digging into those policies, and we are happy to provide support for that. It's part of what we offer free at Workplaces Respond, the National Resource Center, and then the accompanying training that goes with it that should be regular. To I think Jessica mentioned that, and as new things come up, you update the policies again and you retrain. This should be a yearly conversation at the minimum, and and people, really think about like who else from your team should be a part of it. Who should be training? Is it just the HR, or can you bring in some of the supervisors to lead some of those conversations? That would also set such a tone. I know a lot of people tend to lean on like online trainings and videos, and those aren't bad, but when it comes sometimes from internal, like it also sends a very clear message. So all of those things are really important. And within that, in your policies, the last thing I just want to mention is reporting. We hear a couple of things that tend to be problematic if someone wants to report. One is what happens if the manager is the one who's causing the harassment. And in your reporting structure says that you have to actually complain, send a complaint to that person. What does that person do then? What does a woman do if the very person who's supposed to help is actually the person causing the harm? So how do you think through that? Is there a different person that should be like a person in charge of like complaints? That's an important issue to think through, especially if you're small. It's less of an issue when there's an actual formal HR department, but that's something that comes up often. The other thing that happens, you talk about the problematic employee, but Paul, sometimes it's the star employee who's causing the harm. And so that tends to bring a lot of conflict to owners who, of course, don't want to get rid of their best star employee. But sometimes it is really, really important to think about the greater harm that person is causing, not just to the woman, but to the entire environment. And so just having that in mind somewhere, maybe it's not in your policies, but like having to make those hard decisions. We know that they're real. We know they happen because we hear about it. Those were two things that I just wanted to make sure I brought up, because it's easy to think of this as someone who's just terrible, but it's not always the person who's terrible that's causing the harm. So yeah.
I was going to add one thing on the training piece, which is that a lot of the studies that have been done on harassment trainings in the workplace have shown that the more the training can be designed to be applicable to that specific workplace, the better. Kind of the more the workers will actually take it in, and supervisors too, of kind of what their obligations are on the supervisory side or the ownership side, and what, protections workers have. And so ensuring that a training is kind of culturally competent, as they say, is a really good step for owners to take. Also, I wanted to note that, if you're the owner of a smaller company and don't have as many resources as a larger company with a big HR or any HR, there are a lot of resources out there. And so, I'm based in California. And so this is just one example, but our state enforcement agency called the California Civil Rights Department, because our state has a training requirement for employers to provide anti-harassment training, they have free resources on their website of sample trainings. And even though, again, this is California specific, it's something that employers could look to. The EEOC had issued very important guidance for employers and employees, actually, around what harassment is, workplace harassment guidance. That has unfortunately been rescinded, the guidance. The laws are all still the same, but the guidance has been rescinded under the current administration. But that guidance is actually very helpful and still available. We can share it with you to share with your listeners if they would like, because what it has is a lot of real life examples of what harassment like in the real world on the ground. And that can be really helpful because a lot of times employers, especially smaller employers, they want their employees to have a harassment-free workplace. They don't want this type of behavior to happen at their workplace, but they might not know what harassment looks like in all situations. And so having those examples can be really helpful as well. And then I'll note one final report that might be helpful to your listeners, which under the prior EEOC leadership, it's a specific report about harassment in construction, and it's still available on the EEOC website. And that goes through a lot of examples of how harassment comes up and ways for employers to deal with it affirmatively.
I remembered. You started asking this, and so I didn't want to come back to it because it's important. What happens if someone reports? And your policy should define that. What happens to the person who actually reports, but also what happens to the harm doer? Because sometimes what happens, and Jessica spoke to this, the person isn't taken out of the workplace, the person is still there and is still causing harm. And so it's important to kind of spell that out in your policies. What happens when someone reports? What's the exact procedure? If someone wants to do it, because we know that not everyone feels comfortable doing so for all the things we mentioned, but spell that out, make it really simple. And there, one of the projects we also manage here is a project around employment rights. And the things that we highlight is that you can ask for reasonable accommodations, which means there are in all 50 states and U.S. territories, there are very specific laws that employers sadly don't always know about, but they do exist. And if someone were to ask for a reasonable accommodation, which basically means they want to move their work site, like they don't want to be, maybe they're in a front office role, they want to go to the back of the shop, like to for safety reasons, that employers actually have to comply. And so we have a lot of that information on our website, and but that can also help someone who's in a difficult situation, and particularly as an investigation is underway. And so those are just two other things that I want to make sure that I can uplift.
Speaking of resources, I might as well just throw this in there. If a little bit of a resource plug, if you're a tradeswoman listening to this, struggling or not struggling, and you just want to connect with other women, Sisterhood of Trades is always open to more members. We have a rant session chat room where you can talk about the things that happened at work or not work related, but we really push our members to come and find community with us. And a lot of the experiences we do anonymously share via our Sisterhood of Trades LinkedIn account on our blogs. So we post Sisterhood special blogs every week. And actually, one of my partners, Brooke, is very vocal about workplace violence because she has gone through some very dark things that she's actually going to be speaking about on her own social media. So I don't want to say excited to record that, but I am anticipating a good recording.
Well, I'm sure there's no end of good resources, and we will make sure that we share all those links on the podcast page for this show. This show could easily be 2 or 3 times longer, and we still wouldn't cover all the important topics. But hopefully we've given people a bit of a foundation in what they can do if they're not feeling safe in the workplace. Hopefully, even more importantly, to the leaders and owners of the businesses out there, of what they can do to check in with their workplace, make sure it is probably how they want it to be. I've had more than 100 guests on Machine Shop Mastery and gotten to know many of them reasonably well. And I just cannot imagine that a single one of them would feel comfortable knowing that there was people in their workplace that were being harassed, let alone condoning it. or promoting it in the first place. It's unconscionable to me. So, but I'm sure that within those 100 workplaces, there are things that are happening, and these leaders just don't see it and they don't know of it. Or if they do know of it, they're brushing it under the rug because, like you said, Anna, maybe it's that star employee, that brilliant 5-axis programmer or machinist that's, been on the job for 30, 40 years and is just their star performer. But I would, implore with them to make the hard choice and just make sure you address it, whether it's letting that person go and dealing with the fallout, which probably will be less severe than you think, and probably even a blessing in disguise, because I think, as you appropriately said, there are far more advocates out there than probably the troublemakers. And when it is raised and brought to the level of awareness of the whole organization, you'll probably be pleasantly surprised that there's a lot more people that say, yeah, I was not okay with that, but I wasn't going to speak up myself. And I'm glad you dealt with it. I'm glad you did something about it. So hopefully that resonates with some of the people listening today. Any final words before we wrap it up?
If you need support, check out workplacesrespond.org. Happy to follow up with you as a shop owner and setting up policies, environmental scan, whatever you need in order to increase the safety of your workers.
And what about you, Jessica? How do people reach out to your organization?
Yeah, so our website is equalrights.org. And then there's a separate website, if you just Google National Task Force on Tradeswomen's Issues, where you can learn all about that task force. And for tradeswomen or trades workers of other gender identities who are interested in getting support there, please feel free to join, fill out the form to join that. And then finally, I'll send you the links to some of the other resources that owners might be able to use to get some materials that could help them in better kind of proactively addressing these issues. And just want to thank you again, Paul and Nush, for hosting this conversation. I think we're at a time in our kind of society where survivors of harassment or violence are generally feeling more comfortable speaking out. But as we know, especially as we've talked about in this context of the trades, sometimes there's a lot of fear given the risk of retaliation and the need to maintain a paycheck. And so I really appreciate kind of this focus for this podcast so that owners especially can kind of take the steps necessary to try to prevent and better address harassment and ensure it doesn't escalate to the levels of violence that we've unfortunately seen.
Nush, any final words from you? How do people connect with your Discord server? I'm not even sure how to do that.
As always, you can look me up and connect me on LinkedIn, Nush Ahmed, and there you can find basically every single social media that I'm on. You can find the Sisterhood of Trades LinkedIn. Through there, you can find our website, which you can also just look up, sisterhoodoftrades.com. And our Discord link is right there. You can join either as a verified tradeswoman or as an ally. You can also, and I highly suggest you connect with my admins and co-founders. They always post some really important content around femininity, around workplace violence, and around just being in the trades. And you can check out my podcast, Next Gen MFG podcast on Spotify. Thank you so much, Paul, for hosting this and inviting me on. I think this is a very important discussion. And I keep saying this like every week, but I am so incredibly blessed to be working at ProShop and to be working on your team. Like, this is very full circle for me, actually. I think it was like 3 years ago I met you, and now here I am.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm not looking for that kudos or pat on the back. You got here because of who you are and what you're doing, and I appreciate you doing all the important things you do. And I guess I'll just sort of wrap this one up. This was a different kind of podcast than what we normally talk about on Making Chips, but I think it is one of the most fundamentally important topics we've covered in a very long time. I hope all of the owners, leaders out there in the metalworking nation truly believe in their heart that they want to work in a place, own a place, in a place, be part of a business where everybody feels welcome. Everyone can contribute. If they have a passion for metalworking and machining, why in the world would you do anything to dissuade them from following that passion, right? We love this industry so much. We know how critically important it is to every other thing in the world. That's why I wear my Thank a Machinist t-shirt every day. Our industry is the most foundational of all because we create the machines that make everything else in the world possible. And so it is crucial that we embrace and welcome the other half of the workforce that's out there that may want to participate in it. And it's incumbent on us, on each of us, whether you're in a position of leadership or power or not, to speak up and help make your workplaces become safer for all. So thank you for your time listening to this show today. Maybe we'll do another one. Let us know, on LinkedIn or wherever else if this resonated with you and if you want to have more conversations about it. Speaking up is the first step. So thank you all for being here. We normally wrap up our show by saying, if you're not making chips, you're not making money. I'm not sure that's entirely appropriate in this case, but if you don't have a workforce that feels safe and that can do their job, then you're definitely not making chips. And for all of our businesses to thrive, we have to have safe workplaces. So please go check in on your workplace, and thank you so much for listening to this episode.